Larry's words hit harder than I expected as he swaggered into my hospital room with a smug smile. "You can't even handle the simplest tasks at home. Maybe we should just get a divorce," he said coldly. Beside him was a woman I didn't recognize, attached to a tangle of medical equipment. I stayed silent, absorbing the scene. Larry had no idea how much money I had, $10 million, to be exact. His divorce suggestion was almost laughable when I thought about the stakes for someone like me, a housewife. The clarity in my decision grew stronger. I couldn't stay with someone who would degrade me in my most vulnerable moment. With a quiet resolve, I reached into my bag and pulled out the divorce papers I'd kept prepared for this very moment. I handed them over, my smile unshaken as Larry took them from me. "I'll be happier with her, don't worry," Larry declared, casually wrapping his arm around the woman, whom he introduced as Brenda. Brenda shot me a patronizing look and added, "Take care, ma'am, you're not a miss anymore." Their laughter echoed as they left the room. For a brief second, I watched them go, feeling only a faint pang before a burst of laughter escaped me. It was Friday, and by Monday, the divorce would be official. Just 4 days until my freedom, and my heart raced at the thought. My name is Natalie Ruth, a 40-year-old housewife living on a farm. While I may not have many extraordinary talents, I pride myself on my cooking skills. My husband, Larry, and I are the same age and met back in college. After we graduated, we left the countryside and settled in Florida. Just the two of us. I cooked for Larry with fresh vegetables and rice sent from my family. Many believed my cooking was what kept him happy, and I agreed. But household chores? That was never his thing. From the beginning, I took care of Larry, and after marriage, nothing changed. We didn't have children, but we shared a love for food and often took short trips to find new dishes to enjoy. In our early years, Larry was gentle and kind, but around the second year of our marriage, things shifted. He became more controlling, never violent, but his biting words left scars. I soon realized he didn't see the value in a full-time housewife like me, and I started to keep quiet, too tired to argue. Larry initially landed a high-paying job right after college, but within 5 years, he left. After that, he jumped from one job to another, leaving our financial situation in constant turmoil. The stress, paired with his worsening attitude, weighed heavily on our relationship. Yet I kept the home together, hoping for things to improve. For the past 3 years, he'd been at a job he seemed content with, and I quietly held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, this time, he'd stay. Then one day, unexpectedly, he came home early. "I'm home, I quit my job," he announced nonchalantly. "What, again?" I blurted out before I could stop myself. His face darkened. I saw his brow twitch, his irritation rising. Quickly, I backtracked. "Sorry, I didn't mean it that way, just shocked." "No welcome back?" I tried to soften my tone, but he snapped back. "You've gotten bold." I could see the storm in his eyes, so I kept my voice low, careful not to escalate things. "I'm sorry," I muttered, and he seemed to relax enough to sit down on the couch, grumbling as he turned on the TV. I placed a beer and glass on the table. "Dinner or a bath?" I asked. "Food and alcohol," he grumbled. I slipped back into the role of the dutiful wife, one I had played for the past 10 years. After he had his fill of food and drink, Larry fell asleep on the couch, snoring loudly. The table, now a mess of discarded bottles and food scraps, looked like a disaster zone. As I cleaned, I thought back to when things were easier, before Larry changed, before our marriage became a series of compromises. I glanced at him, asleep and oblivious, and wondered if it was finally time to break free. The next day, while Larry set off to look for another job, I went to the city office and signed the divorce papers. I wasn't ready to file them yet, but having them gave me some peace of mind. I tucked them discreetly into my bag, wondering what Larry would do if he ever found them. "Where'd you go while I was job hunting?" he asked when I returned home. "I went to buy some resumes for you. Thought you might need them," I answered, handing him a small stack. He looked at them curiously but quickly lightened up. He mentioned meeting a friend for drinks and left soon after. His new job was with a solid company that offered a better salary and benefits than his last one. Maybe this time, I thought, he would stick around long enough to retire. Larry started spending more evenings out, leaving me with precious moments of solitude. I used this time to gather my thoughts and regain my strength. One afternoon, my mother called with exciting news. It had been a while since we last spoke, and she couldn't contain her excitement. "We had our mountains and lands appraised, and they're worth $9 million, she exclaimed. "We only need $5 million for our retirement, so you need to think about what this means for you." My mother had always been wary of Larry, especially as he grew more controlling and isolated me from my childhood home. The windfall was a shock, but what stunned me even more was that my mother had transferred the property titles from my grandmother to me, to avoid inheritance taxes. Now, with a heavy decision weighing on me, I debated whether to share the news with Larry or keep it as my own secret leverage, a means to secure my newfound freedom. A week later, life took another unexpected turn. I was involved in a car accident. Thankfully, the injuries weren't life-threatening, but they required a week-long stay in the hospital. After locking up my valuables in the room's drawer, I reluctantly dialed Larry's number. "I'm sorry, I got hurt," I said, my voice tinged with the exhaustion of the moment. His response, predictably, was self-centered. But what about my meals?" he asked with no sign of concern for me. I fought to keep my frustration in check and explained, "I'll be in the hospital for a week. Could you manage without me until then?" His reply, void of any empathy, stung. That night, I had planned to talk to him about the inheritance, but his dismissive reaction made me rethink everything. With a cold resolve, I pulled out the divorce papers I had kept hidden in my bag, almost like a shield, and handed them to Larry. My smile was forced, but my heart was steady. "Here, I guess it's time to say goodbye," I said. Larry took the papers, a smug grin spreading across his face. "I'll be happier with her," he declared, his arm wrapping around the young woman, who leaned in with a mocking tone. "Take care, madam," she sneered. "Oh wait, you're not a madam anymore. Take care, old lady." Their laughter echoed in my ears as they left, but instead of bitterness, I felt a strange sense of relief. Free from his cruelty, I was finally in control of my life, with a significant inheritance and a future to rebuild on my own terms. Friday came, and as I lay in the hospital bed, a burst of laughter bubbled up inside me. The divorce papers had been handed over, and by Monday, the process would be complete. The weekend passed in peaceful silence, a welcome break from the chaos, though it felt strangely unsettling, as I was so used to his constant demands. On Monday evening, my phone started ringing non-stop. After nearly half an hour of persistent calls, I decided to answer. "Why didn't you file the papers?" Larry's furious voice blasted through the phone. His outrage only made me laugh harder, which, in turn, seemed to only fuel his anger. "I've already filed a notice of non-acceptance," I told him between chuckles, reminding him of all the empty threats he'd made over the years. He was livid, demanding that I withdraw it, but I was no longer the woman who jumped at his every whim. Calmly, I told him that nothing could be done until I was discharged from the hospital, and that we'd have to resolve it at the municipal office when the time came. His selfishness was almost laughable, but it didn't stop there. In a rush, Larry blurted out that he planned to register his marriage with Brenda, the woman he'd introduced as his new partner. He quickly corrected himself, realizing he had revealed too much too soon. When I teasingly asked if her name was Kaveen and if she was his mistress, Larry responded bluntly, "She's my new wife, and technically your mistress since we're not divorced yet." His tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were stating a simple fact. I kept my composure, knowing his words were meant to provoke, and his frustration only grew as I remained unfazed. Finally, deciding to strike a more serious note, I informed him that he would be hearing from my lawyer regarding the division of our assets. I reminded him how I had always managed our home and remained faithful, while pointing out his own role in the collapse of our marriage. Larry seemed genuinely puzzled, almost as if my inability to perform housework from a hospital bed was somehow a betrayal. I patiently explained that being hospitalized didn't equate to neglect, and that his lack of support during this time spoke volumes about his true character. The conversation ended with Larry flustered, an image vastly different from the confident, self-assured man who had strutted out of the hospital room just days before. As I lay in my hospital bed recovering, the absurdity of Larry's expectations became clearer. He seemed to believe that I was still responsible for his well-being, even in the face of my injury, equating my inability to take care of housework with some form of failure on my part. His logic was so skewed that it would be laughable in front of a judge. Still, despite his gradual realization that he had crossed a line, he stubbornly clung to the idea that he was justified, especially now that he had Brenda by his side, and he claimed he no longer needed me. I reminded him sharply that his secret relationship with Brenda amounted to cheating, a point he stubbornly refused to accept. His circular arguments were growing tiresome, so I decisively cut the conversation short, telling him to communicate through our lawyers from that point on. I hung up, ignoring the flood of calls that followed until he finally gave up. However, the peace was short-lived. The next morning, my phone began ringing relentlessly from 8 a.m. When I finally answered, Larry was on the other end, ranting about being unable to withdraw money from a bank account. He seemed utterly confused as to why he couldn't access funds from what he assumed was a joint account. "Are you trying to withdraw from my personal account?" I asked, and when he confirmed he was, his anger flared. I had already taken precautionary steps, calling the bank ahead of time to temporarily block any withdrawals while I was in the hospital, knowing Larry's tendency to act impulsively. Larry, however, seemed unable to grasp the simple logic that I had protected myself from potential financial exploitation. He demanded I authorize a withdrawal immediately, failing to see the impropriety of trying to access funds from an account belonging to someone he was in the process of divorcing. I calmly explained that we were essentially strangers now, and I had no obligation to finance a stranger's needs. My newfound assertiveness stunned him, but it felt right. After 12 years of marriage, I had finally learned to stand my ground. He insisted that I send him money, even suggesting I owed him compensation for not performing household duties. It was almost absurd. After all these years, Larry had failed to grasp the basic concept of respect and personal responsibility. I repeated that any financial settlements would be handled through our lawyers, and his frustration grew. In a fit of rage, he threatened to visit me in the hospital. Unfazed, I calmly responded that if he did, I was prepared. I had already informed the nursing staff to only allow visits from my parents, anticipating his attempts to barge in. Larry, undeterred, tried to visit but was stopped at the nurse's station. Frustrated, he turned to flooding my phone with calls and messages. I saved them as evidence and contacted my lawyer, who quickly intervened, halting the barrage of notifications. Just when I thought the drama had subsided, an unexpected twist came. I was told that, grateful for Denise's unwavering support and the strength of our 15-year friendship, I left the hospital the next day with newfound resolve. I headed to a private dining room at a restaurant where a meeting had been arranged. To my surprise, when I arrived, I found Larry and Brenda already seated, casually enjoying an expensive traditional meal. Larry, ever the audacious one, had the nerve to remind me to bring money to cover their meal. Unshaken, I refused, telling them to settle their bill themselves. I was there to assert my rights to the assets, not to subsidize their lunch. Ignoring Larry's snide comments, I and my lawyer sat down and began laying out the case. We presented clear evidence, legal documents and statements highlighting Larry's faults and the terms for the division of property. The papers made it plain that the responsibility for the dissolution of our marriage was his alone, and I was ready to defend my interests with determination. The meeting, meant to settle the terms of the divorce, took place in that private dining room, with Larry, Brenda, my lawyer, and unexpectedly, Denise, as Larry and Brenda ate, blissfully unaware of the confrontation about to unfold. My lawyer and I unveiled a series of damning photographs. These photos, taken by Denise, showed Larry and Brenda together, and even more shockingly, captured Brenda entering a hotel with another man. The guilt and surprise were written all over their faces as they stopped mid-meal. Just then, Denise walked in, confirming she was the one who had taken the photos. Brenda's face fell when she realized her aunt was involved in this meeting. Denise, loyal to me, expressed her disappointment in Brenda's actions but reiterated her commitment to our friendship. Despite seeking compensation from Brenda for her behavior, in the heat of the confrontation, Brenda blurted out that she was pregnant. The claim stunned Larry, but it quickly unraveled when Denise, unconvinced, noted that Brenda showed no visible signs of pregnancy. Under pressure, Brenda admitted the pregnancy story was a fabrication, a ploy to secure Larry's commitment. She confessed that her tactic was to target affluent older men, and her web of lies began to unravel. Larry, caught in his own deceit, was left speechless. Denise, ever the voice of reason, took charge of the situation and led a contrite Brenda away, promising a formal apology later. Left alone with me, Larry scrambled to salvage whatever he could of our relationship. He pleaded for a fresh start, even attempting to use my lack of recent work experience against me, suggesting I couldn't make it on my own. Calmly, I rejected his advances and revealed my substantial personal net worth, around $10 million, acquired through inheritance funds that were not part of our marital assets. With my financial independence secure, I reiterated my intention to move forward with the divorce. The fallout was swift. Under pressure from her family, Brenda transferred a sum of money into my account as compensation, and her mother made sure she worked to make amends. As for Larry, now estranged from his family, he faced serious repercussions. He was fired from his job, his reputation tarnished by his indiscretions, and was forced to take on multiple construction jobs to manage his mounting debts. Once the divorce was finalized, I redirected the money I received to charity and made the bold decision to relocate to the countryside, starting a new life on my own terms. Meanwhile, Denise and I reignited our friendship. We made plans to remain single, live together, and indulge in our shared passions for food and travel. Together, we looked forward to embarking on culinary adventures, taking short trips, and celebrating the freedom and strength of our bond. Excitement filled me as I prepared for a future where I could live authentically, true to myself, and embrace the joy of newfound freedom.